Well, good morning, dear colleagues, distinguished delegate, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and joining us. If you're sitting in the back, feel free. There's 2 chairs at the table. We can put some in the front. We're not going to have PowerPoints. My name is Chantaline Carpentier. I'm the head of the Trade, Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development branch at UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. All of this doesn't fit actually in the typical business card. It's so long, so apologies. But we're going to be discussing about a likewise long title, but very important. It's enabling a just transition, trade and industrial policies, option for developing countries on climate action and principle for cooperation. So this is probably using about 5% of the whole time that we have, but it's important. This is a joint effort between the trade environment and the SDGs. Tess colleague, Irina, who could not be here, unfortunately, because they didn't get their speaking permit, unfortunately. And the Yale Center for Environmental Policy, Dan Estee, working on the Remaking Trade. He's probably going to invite you to the 2 p.m. this afternoon session on that, as well as my dear colleague Assad from UNEP. So this is a joint endeavor because we all believe this is a very important topic, and this is a multi-disciplinary, everything topic, and therefore it was important to all get together. We also want to thank ISSD for hosting and getting us all together in this Trade Knob, which is a great venue for discussing across the street from the WTO. So quickly, let me introduce the panelists. We're going to start with Mr. Assad Naqvi, as I mentioned. He's the head of economic and trade policy at UNEP. And we've been working very closely together on the UN network of economists. And you'll hear me talk about the new economics for sustainable development, i.e. we need a new business model, a new economic model. But though it's not the topic today, we'll research. Caroline Birkbeck, that you all know, I'm sure, executive director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs, better known as TESS. And Dan Estee, Hillhouse professor at Yale University. Let me set the context. All countries are facing pressure to deploy global and national effort toward achieving worldwide carbon neutrality and net zero greenhouse gas emission by or around mid-century, right? This is no news. To ensure this transition in green and inclusive, in a green, inclusive, and cost-effective way, we must overhaul the entire economy based on fossil fuel through novel industrial services and agricultural policies. Question is how? And this is the topic of today's talk that you will hear. And what we want to ask, and we've asked each panelist, is what type of industrial and trade policies are available for developing countries? And we're focusing on developing countries, that's UNCTAD's mandate. What are the principles that they need to consider when designing trade-related climate policies to enable this just transition? And finally, are we spending money wisely in this transition, considering the climate, industrial, and subsidies issues? So let me start from an UNCTAD perspective here. If my computer could stick to where we are, it would be easier. So basically, to answer the first question from an UNCTAD's perspective, the guiding principles are very simple. Because the international community, our member states, have already agreed on principles. One of them is the common but differentiated responsibility agreed at the UNFCCC by all member states. And the second one is the leaving no one behind, which is actually one of the key principles of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. But there's another principle that's becoming equivalently, apparently, important. And it's alignment. It's alignment and coherence of policies. We will have to undergo the largest transformation of our economies that humanity has never done. We will need massive public investment to basically in infrastructure to ensure that it's adapted to climate change, but also to actually accomplish the tripling of our renewable energy, the doubling of our energy efficiency, but also the defossilizing of our manufacturing base so that we can achieve this net zero. That will require these investments. Some of them will be considered subsidies. Some of them will or not be aligned with the WTO agreement. And we're very happy to have Dynasty with us because he's just published a paper on making trade work for sustainable development. And then he has a matrix on here on subsidies. So he's proposing some changes to the way we address subsidies, to not just at looking whether they are trade distortive given the context. But also we will need coherency in our policies. And then we've not been very good at that. We have line ministries that usually do not really talk to each other. We just did a review of the NDCs from 60 developing countries. And by reviewing them, one thing that comes out clearly is that the environmental ministry and the planning ministry that lead on the nationally determined contribution are not really talking to their trade colleagues. And so the trade-related measures are not exploited. The investment measure, to a lesser extent, are not also exploited to their fully. There are agreements that are already negotiated that could be used. And as long as it doesn't mention trade-related measure, it doesn't activate then the aid for trade potential that could be tapped to help those developing countries. So we do feel that we're going to have, and Dan laughed at me yesterday, my French sometimes gets in the way, but we need to go nitty-gritty here. And
Not nitty-gritty, nitty-gritty.
So that we actually we're going to have to go at the national level and look at where are the synergies and the trade-offs between these climate policies and the SDGs, so that we can actually capture the synergies. But once we find trade-off, bring the international community together and see how do we help these countries if we want to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius common goal that we have, as well as the SDGs that we set for ourselves. And so government will need policy space to do that. Those governments, especially from developing countries, that now are spending more on education, on servicing their foreign debt than on education and health together, won't have the fiscal space to put these investments in place that we just talked about. So what's the role of the international community in that case? And there are other issues of policy coherence at the international level. On the one hand, many of these measures that we're finally putting in place are having positive spillover effect, right? Because it's leading other countries to put in place these subsidies that are needed. It's leading countries to put in place carbon pricing. But some of them have negative spillover effect, such as the huge increase in bureaucratic requirement that a lot of developing countries, small, medium enterprises do not have the capacity to do. Or the potential market access challenges that many developing countries would face in facing these new climate-related policies. But on the good side, there's also a lot of positive business opportunity for developing countries. Developing countries typically have a comparative advantage on non-plastic substitute. We just had a session on non-plastic substitute. They have a comparative advantage. You look at Africa, right? I'm looking like my colleague from the Commonwealth. But basically, they have the land base. They have the critical mineral. They have the increasingly capable labor force. And therefore, they should be leading on renewable energy. But they should also be leading in value added in renewable energy, not just exporting the critical minerals, because clearly the manufacturing base, the cheapest way to produce those decarbonized goods, should be in Africa. Same with Latin America, with lots of critical minerals and comparative advantage. So we need to make sure there's coherence at the international level, so those comparative advantage that are emerging for developing countries don't get thwarted inadvertently by those policies that we're trying to do good. So I'll stop here because we have a great panel and I want to make sure I hear from everybody. And Assad has been working a lot on the page at UNEP and several of those issues. So Assad, let's start by our first question, right? So what are the guiding principles that we need to use to ensure that we have a just and green transition?
Thank you so much for setting the stage, and thank you so much for organizing this panel and the invitation to UNEP to join as a co-host, but also as a speaker. So highly appreciated, and looking forward to continue that cooperation with all of you. So I come from the environment community. It's my first ministerial conference of the trade that I'm joining, and it feels like it's two different worlds. So I have to start with a very few basic things on environment and climate and poverty issues, and three data sets and small points. During the last 23 years, and now the environment colleagues are gonna laugh at me that who doesn't know it. During the last 23 years, we had the 15 hottest year, which broke record after record after record. We had some of the worst impacts of the climate change, including on Pakistan in the form of floods, which devastated the economy. The hurricanes are everywhere, the drought is everywhere, the floods are everywhere. So those were some of the numbers which I talked to my trade colleagues that didn't know about, that we had the 15 hottest years in 23 years of this century. That is one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is that the inequality is getting to a level which is unimaginable like 20 years ago. To the extent that the 3.5 billion people, poorest people, contribute less than 5% to the global GDP. 3.5 billion people. Now look at the climate impact of that, where 1% of the richest population in the world has a carbon footprint that is equivalent to 5 billion poorest people. That is 2/3 of the humanity. How many are 1% out of 7 billion? Yeah. So that is the second data point that we need to look at. On the solution side, where we are talking about transition, the emissions by 1% are equivalent, and they can cancel out the carbon saving produced by 1 million wind turbines. So that is the scale we are looking at, and that is the inequality we are looking at. And then on the third side, of course, there are challenges for developing countries, and you're asking us to focus on developing countries. I see, of course, poverty, inequality a big challenge, but on the economic side, the fiscal space is very, very tight and getting tighter by the passing day. So now, investing in environmental issues or sustainability alone, will that stay a priority? I think that's a point for discussion. Number two, debt is a big problem, and debt sustainability is a bigger problem, and debt servicing is further tightening the space. For not having debt or not having fiscal space, and the inability or the risk to unable to pay the debt is downing the rating of these countries, which makes borrowing the money from international markets even more expensive, which then devaluates your currency, which then inflates your external debts because you are paying in dollars. Now, in that space, if the countries are already doing or at least staying committed to the agenda of sustainable development, that should be considered an achievement and must be appreciated and valued and acknowledged and rewarded. Now, going to the principles, and that's where my principles are coming from. Number one, the first principle that should be part of our transition planning and trade and economic growth agenda: put the poverty reduction at the heart of transition planning and trade policies. Now, why do I say this? Because number one, I believe that it's possible. Number two, I believe that it's affordable to link climate action and poverty reduction efforts. I come from a very small village in Pakistan, so my data sets are from that village, but I have seen them applicable in rest of the South Asia, many African countries. We can provide uninterrupted energy supplies to the poorest 20% household with $1,000 investment. And renewable energy has made that possible. So in these households, and in Pakistan, the household size is like 4 to 5 people. So you are taking, and basically you are, as they say, the economy does not grow in dark. So access to energy is the remaining 30% above the poorest 20% will take about $2,000 per household to provide them uninterrupted electricity supplies. Okay. So that is the first point, that bring the two sides together, and that's where we will be winning the battle on poverty, on trade and SMEs. Then from the household, take it to the small and medium enterprises at the village level, where they add a little bit value. Where the value add is from wheat to the flour, and flour to the naan or chapati, the value addition is 10 times on the wheat of the price. From the rice, to the flour of the rice, it's again 5 to 10 times. And then take it to the smallholder farmers. So that is one part, and I can speak a lot about it. What UNEP is doing, I think that's important. We have developed tools and services which help countries to take an integrated approach on poverty reduction, economic growth, trade policies, as well as on environmental action. That is a system dynamic approach that we are taking to the economy, which brings all the three. And it is to assist the policymakers on looking for what are the policy and investment options which will create the maximum impact on the three areas, on growth, poverty reduction, and environmental dimensions. So, for example, the Mauritius Action Plan Against Inequality, or South Africa's Economic Recovery Plan from COVID-19, or Economic Competitiveness Policy of Peru are some of the examples of 116 policies that we have supported in 22 countries, and we can go further. The second part is on financing, and I will be very short because everybody will speak about it. Without financing, things will not change. Number two, that's where the common responsibility has to come in. Only developing countries will not be able to do it, and we need the global system to come together. From the UNEP side, we have made a humble effort of creating Net Zero Export Credit Alliance of the agency so that we can promote green trade, finance green trade. We are launching a global program which is called Net Zero Nature Positive Accelerator, which will help countries not only to go climate, but also on nature and biodiversity, because that is the ecological foundation of the economy. I stop here.
Thank you so much. And indeed, the triple environmental crisis is important. Here we focus on climate, but indeed, we need to stack the E and the S and all of the environmental issues. So all E's need to be stacked as well. And indeed, you did mention there are a lot of business opportunities, and those are MSMEs, usually in developing countries, and they need the support. They don't get trade finance, and therefore that's a major limit. I think we had agreed that, Dan, you were coming second, and then Carolyn will come third. So what are your two principles, Dan?
So let me just say thank you, Chantaline, for organizing us, and to your whole UNCTAD team that's been behind this now for some months. And I am here representing not only my own work at Yale, but the Remaking Trade project that a number of you in the room have contributed to over the last 2 years. And in particular, Jean-Yves Remy at the University of the West Indies, Joel Trackman at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, who've been my co-coordinators of that effort. And as Chantaline mentioned, we're having a session on that broader Remaking Trade agenda this afternoon, 2 o'clock in Room A next door. So please come if you want to get into the broader dialogue. But at the invitation of our chair, I'm going to jump right into the principles that I think are fundamental to make this transition work on a basis that is both just but also successful. And I do think that's the starting point for all of us. So my principle number one, and really I'm echoing Assad's starting point as well, and that is that we have to remember there is a sustainability imperative in the 21st century going forward. And that we, in the 20th century, started to recognize these problems. You know, I personally go back to COP0, which was the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. And at that moment, we knew we had problems. We first brought forward in a big way the concept of sustainable development. We signed at that time the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. But I think one of the disturbing things is we've now gone 30-some years without serious progress. In fact, the global stocktake at COP28 tells us emissions are still rising, not falling. So while we can acknowledge that the issues are being taken more seriously, I think the moment is now ripe for principle number one, which is we really have to get serious. You joked that you were saying things that your colleagues thought for 20 years everyone's known. I'm now going to say something that's been known for 100 years, which is that we need to internalize negative externalities. We need to implement the polluter pays principle. And that has at least been acknowledged since the 1992 Rio Declaration. And I would argue since Pagoo wrote his 1918 famous economics paper on this principle. So I am even more echoing what we should all know, but seemingly don't. So principle one, there should be no further uninternalized negative externalities. Let's get serious about the polluter pays principle. It is not new. It's widely accepted. It's been validated in dozens of international agreements. What might be new is to take it seriously. And
that's a good one.
I think I'll stop. I would say that I think we can start by figuring out how to translate it into action mode, and that maybe is not what's been what we need and hasn't been done. So in that regard, I would argue that we should have a principle that no company should get competitive advantage in traded goods. This is the link to the trade system for underperforming against agreed upon environmental commitments. And I would start with greenhouse gas emissions reductions as committed by every member of the WTO to the 2015 Paris Agreement, and the trajectory that needs to hit net zero emissions by mid-century as committed by every WTO member in the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact. So I think the idea that we should take seriously holding the polluters to account is now ripe. But as I think all of us are going to do, a second principle has to be pursued in parallel, and to make fair and appropriate principle one. And that second principle is a principle of equity. And I frankly don't care how you want to define it. It can be common but differentiated responsibility. It can be special and differential treatment. I think there is trouble with both of those phrases. Some countries and economic groupings, not to hint at who that might be, lose it when you suggest we need to bring common but differentiated responsibility into the trade system. And rather than have them flip out, I think we should just say there needs to be an equity principle. We need to acknowledge that developing countries come to the conversation from a different starting point. And frankly, the trade world doesn't have a better answer, because the tradition there of special and differential treatment has been equally unsuccessful in driving forward a process of really taking developing countries seriously. So in the DLR framework, we've advanced a number of ideas to go beyond where we are and really dig into the details of what's needed. So in 30 seconds, let me just say, we need real capacity building. We need finance. We need support for innovation at a country appropriate scale and recognizing comparative opportunities that vary from place to place. And we need a structure that does this in a systematic way. Our simple proposal in that regard, and I'm happy to talk about this in more detail, and we'll talk about it this afternoon in more detail, is to repurpose the little sister of the WTO and UNCTAD, which is an entity that some of you will heard of, but maybe not others, the International Trade Center, and that it be repurposed as a sustainable trade center with a mission to a new charge to help small and middle-sized enterprises in the developing world meet not only the needs of being ready for trade, of how to do customs and tariffs, but how to meet sustainability standards.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, so definitely we can't be sticking, this is an emergency we're having in front of us, and sticking to trying to win the war on words and phrases is not the aim here. I would add to what you're saying, CBDR versus equity versus anything else, the phrase of technology transfer. Every time, it's like under mutually agreed terms. What does that mean? And could we just talk about access to affordable technologies for this transition? And maybe we can start having a discussion instead of shutting down as soon as you say the word. I think these are the common thing that we need to, and then on the externalities, to the benefit of DG Ngozi, she did create this task force on carbon pricing with the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, UNCTAD, and UNFCCC, and we're looking at what does that mean given the equity and the equilibrium, so the externalities taken into account. So we're very excited about that. And we hope to have a report by the annual meeting in the fall. And finally, you mentioned about the technology and innovation. And I want to go back to link with Assad, because it's oftentimes when we talk about technology, we think about Cambridge and Silicon Valley and high capital investment, right? But there's a lot of technologies, like Assad mentioned, that are low tech, adapted to these communities, often come up bottom up from those communities, but they don't get funded because they don't get documented, and we don't have the appropriate funding format for these smaller credit and loans. So that's something else we need to address. Caroline, what are your two guiding principles you want to share with us?
Thank you very much, Chantaline, for the invitation to work with you on this event. So I'm going to be somewhat challenged in this because I don't have 2 principles but 6, but I'm going to go for 2. So just stepping back for a second, in the work that we do around the WTO, it's clear that one of the challenges governments face is how to have a conversation around this very complex set of issues. And you hear many developing countries are asking for a discussion around the sort of principles that should guide how we think about trade-related climate measures, and particularly around just transition. There have been a number of submissions from governments about that. So in our work at TESS, we thought, how can we contribute to that discussion? And so the context is that all countries face domestic political economy constraints in tackling the climate transition. If they need to act urgently, they need to take a lot of tough decisions nationally, which means that they have various domestic pressure groups that face concerns about the impacts on them. So they're trying to manage their whole domestic political economy, concerns around shifting investment, concerns about employment, competitiveness on the global stage. Some countries are getting left behind in the transition. So in that context, the concern that I think many countries have, and we have at TESS, is countries only look inwardly to how to focus their national, how to solve their national political economy problem, when in fact we know that the climate challenge is one that will require international cooperation, solidarity, and coordination. And we also know that we will need trade to work in that context. There's all kinds of ways in which we'll need to facilitate and enable trade to meet our climate goals. So we can't afford to erode the fabric of the trading system while acting urgently. So it's a really complex challenge. And so what we thought could be useful as a part of the picture is to sit back and look at what does the wider fabric of international law tell us about the principles that should guide us. And you hear it really focused from the CBDR issue, but I don't think it's only that. What we did is we convened a group of 17 very eminent international legal experts with backgrounds in climate law, environment law, public international law, and trade law, and said, go to this body of law and tell us what do you think are some of the key principles that governments should have in mind, and that would help hopefully guide some of these conversations that happen nationally and in parliaments and among policymakers who are not thinking about the wider international picture enough. And so we published this report in September last year. I have copies here. It's not that they discovered any new principles that weren't there, but they focused on 6, on sovereignty, prevention, cooperation, prohibition of arbitrary and unjustifiable discrimination. And then they had a cluster, sustainable development, equity, and CBDR. They again sort of, we'll come back to that point in a minute. And the last was transparency and consultation. And the point that they made is all 6 of these principles are relevant. It's not that one has priority over another. But just to underline, the report is relatively short and sweet. It just has 3 pages or so on each of the principles. But what it does, I think, is really remind us, for example, on sovereignty, that countries have regulatory autonomy, both in regard to their emission reduction targets and the means to pursue them. Governments under WTO law have a right to regulate in the public interest. If you look at prevention, countries have a due diligence to do their utmost to protect the environment. But there's also a duty of proportionality to the degree of the risk of harm, and their duty varies depending on their level of development. So for each of these principles, they had a very nuanced approach around cooperation, and cooperation is embedded in the United Nations Charter. You know, states have the duty to cooperate with one another. If you look at WTO jurisprudence, the appellate body and the panels have all emphasized that fundamentally governments need first to try to cooperate. Before taking measures, they need to consult, they need to be transparent. So these are things that are there, we need to remind ourselves. Similarly, in the climate regime, we have long recognized challenges of equity, of poverty, of sustainable development. It's there from the beginning, and so is CBDR. But those principles of equity and sustainable development are there in the trading system as well. So if we can be guided by some of these principles, it will at least create a shared understanding of the complexity of the problem that we have, and that will help us to design trade-related climate measures in a way that hopefully is more reflective of this need that we need to be building to solve the climate challenge. A system of cooperation that works urgently now, but also for the next 5, 10, 20 years. We're not going to solve the climate problem next year. We need a trading system also that is robust and that countries can believe and have trust in a shared understanding going forward. So that's what our work is. Oh my gosh, I was going to take 3 and now I've taken 5. I'll stop.
It's hard, right? So thank you so much, Carolyn, because so we have equity, we have poverty, we have sovereignty, we have cooperation, solidarity. I think all of those are and I think emergency, urgency is another principle. Prepare your questions because we're going to do a second round, and I'm going to ask the panelists to be very concise, and I will enforce it. What would be the most adequate form or mix of industrial competitive policy for climate action that would be guided? Now that we know the principles, what is it? So who wants to volunteer to go first? Who's ready to go first? And please prepare your questions. All right, I'm going to have to nominate someone. Dan?
All right, so I think governments everywhere have a mix of 3 policy elements that most people want to use in some combination, and those include command and control regulation, where you, in effect, set standards that mandate people move towards what's required for a clean energy future. Market mechanisms, this is making people pay for the harm they cause. It's the carbon pricing, but ultimately, as several people have suggested, one might argue for broader sustainability pricing. So you're getting people to be nature positive and making them pay for damage to biodiversity as well. And then number 3 is the idea of subsidies. Of if you can't politically get around to making people pay for the harm, the alternative, the fallback, clearly a second best, but maybe better than doing nothing, is to support those that are leading the way to the alternative future that's required. And I do think all of those, by the way, come with some challenges. All of them can be done in a way that's careful and attentive to trade impacts on your trade partners. And all of them can be done in ways that are attentive to the needs of developing countries or not. And I think fundamentally, our challenge is to ensure that the or not is not the reality, but rather people do this in that careful, thoughtful way that brings people along as opposed to jarring others as we work to move to that sustainable future.
Wow, excellent. 1 minute and 20. Wow, good. Love it. You guys have a standard has been established, just for the record.
No, he gave his time to others.
Oh, I see.
As they say, I yield back my time.
I see you are ready then. Why don't you go forward?
Well, thank you. My feeling is that it's, as we have been talking, and thank you so much for setting the stage, it's a combination of policies, but I would say development policies and planning, trade policies, and particularly for developing countries, the employment creation and job creation policies. And that's where, the work on green jobs is very, very important. Because, and the last one, which will come as a mix, is the policies that repurpose the subsidies, and it's huge. IMF says that 7% of the global GDP is now hostage to the fossil fuel subsidies, that's impact, and then there is agriculture subsidies, and we hope that something will happen to the fisheries subsidies, etc. So that is one part. The second part is that these efforts will need to be complemented with access to technologies, finance, especially the intermediate technologies, as we call them, and international cooperation. There was a question whether what we are spending is wisely, that you had asked us to look at, and I was looking at it, that when we did all these subsidies and everything, it was a wise decision. We needed to generate growth at that time, but the time has changed, the realities have changed. So the new wisdom has to align with the new realities. And that's why I think we did with University of Oxford a global recovery observatory that you may have seen on the spending that was done for recovery from COVID-19. And the picture was very clear. It is still the old wisdom which is prevailing. And now we have developed a tool which will look at the peacetime spending of the public expenditures. And it will just be a mirror that, okay, if you are investing here, don't expect different results. Thank you.
Wow, you guys are being very good. Okay, so development, trade, job creation policy, repurposing the subsidies, because clearly, some of them, we should reuse them in agriculture or switching, or from fossil fuel to renewable energy.
And trade competitiveness.
And competitiveness, yeah. And as you say, because that helps the political economy as well, because oftentimes it's really hard because many middle classes also disappearing in many of our countries. So if you want to put these policies in place, you need the support of your population, right? So, Caroline, let's see how you do. No pressure.
Quick.
You have 30 seconds.
So in good news, I agree with them. The one thing that I would say is I think when we hear from developing countries on this topic, there's a concern about green subsidies that the others, I mean, there's a recognition that green subsidies will be necessary to drive change, especially the change they need to see in the most carbon-intensive developed countries, but also a concern that they can't match these. So are they going to be left behind in a context where you don't have fiscal space, you're not getting the climate finance you need, and you can't borrow on the international market? You're considered too risky for many of your businesses to invest and so on. So there's this massive kind of gap in access to the resources. So what they tend to prefer to talk about is a wider discussion around green industrial policy and development. You know, how are they going to position themselves in this net zero 2050 world to be competitive, especially when they're getting whacked by the impacts of the climate crisis on their productivity and on their supply chains. So I would just say that they talk about a wider set of green industrial policy and trade issues, including issues around long-standing issues around market access for products that are sustainably produced that they can export. Second is they are interested in this issue of affordable access to technologies and technological dissemination as key. And also, I think one of the issues that we must bear in mind is that it's not only for them to do domestically, it will rely on partnerships and cooperation. So when we design these green industrial policies, which many developed countries seem to need to do in order to get the domestic political economy right, to drive climate action, we must be thinking about how we can create some virtuous circles for others in supply chains, for other countries to profit and prosper as we do this transition, because there's no point having a two-tier green global economy. We need them to be part of that dynamic, and I think that's something that it's not only a national problem for them to sort out, it's something that we need to create some more sort of dynamic, virtuous prosperity for them in this transition as well. 2 minutes.
You did pretty well.
Can I jump in on that and reclaim one of my minutes?
Is that a two-hand? Yes, you. I knew you were banking it.
I'm a believer in cap and trade. I wanted to just say one more thing, which is I'm building on what Carolyn just said. I do think the WTO needs a new subsidies framework. And for all who've been into the details of this, you would know the system forever has asked only one question when a subsidy is challenged. And that question has been, is it trade disruptive? I think the Marrakesh Agreement that set the WTO up tells us that's not the right starting point. The opening paragraph of that Marrakesh Agreement basically says that the trade system is not about opening markets or trade liberalization per se, it's about sustainable development. So the first question I think that WTO should ask is the challenged government spending sustainability positive or negative? And then you can ask whether it's trade disruptive or not. And that creates a little bit of a 2x2 matrix, but it's an important shift from where we are now. And then some subsidies that are not trade disruptive and are sustainability positive should be seen as getting a green light going forward. Some of those subsidies that are sustainability positive may have trade impacts, and I would give those a yellow light and then subject them to review to make sure they're not unnecessarily trade disruptive. And I can give criteria. For those who want more details, I've just published a paper with a woman at the University of Geneva named Elena Chima, just come out in the Journal of International Economic Law, that goes into the details that we don't, in my 10 more seconds, have the time to go into. But then there's a third category of things that are not trade disruptive, but sustainability negative. The WTO would say, well, not trade disruptive, we have nothing more to say. We believe that's wrong. If it's sustainability negative, you should be against it, WTO. And then there's a category that's both trade disruptive and sustainability problematic. That's the double bad box, and I believe the WTO should come down hard on that. And I close there because this is where the opportunity exists for developing countries to adopt this strategy and use it to pound down the production-based agriculture and the fossil fuel subsidies that are hugely disadvantaging to the developing world. So if this framework were adopted, an enormous opportunity could be created, especially if we took seriously the obligation of countries to close out as quickly as possible any subsidy that's in that double bad box.
Double bad. We don't want double bad. Okay, so do we have any questions? Yes. Okay, we start here.
Well,
And keep those short. You've seen that we've managed to keep the speakers short.
on a lighter note, yesterday we organized a panel discussion on the dispute settlement. Chantal,
Listening.
we organized a panel on dispute settlement, and we created a Guinness record. All the 6 speakers spoke right to the dot, 5 to 7 minutes.
Wow.
One of them was Christoph, sitting here. So that was fantastic. And as a chair, I thought it was my first ever experience to have been able to get a disciplined panel. Don't take this out of my contribution. But I thought it is important because we keep on talking about things seriously, but including the modicum of how we converse is equally important, which is what you highlighted. I think there's one factor which I would like the 3 speakers to address, which has not been stated very obviously, is the advancement in technology to deal with many of these problems. Let us not forget that human endeavor and civilizationally we are able to advance comparatively. Now, if you go back to the problem of fossil fuels, it was the invention of the steam engine which set up the industrial revolution, and the whole humanity has gained out of it. Now, of course, coal was being used to burn.
You better be careful, your clock is running
We
on.
have 6 speakers, 7
No,
speakers.
fine. No, what I'm trying to say is that technological advancement is very important for us to think about. That there are many of these problems which can be solved through technology rather than through policy measures. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Stayed within a minute. Can we all agree 1 minute for the questions? Good. Yes, go ahead.
You didn't take my light-hearted note.
Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks also to all the speakers. Very good points coming up. My question is, how do we make it work? What we want, the polluter pay, the issues of sovereignty and policy space. Because when you look at what's happening here in the trade policy arena, all those issues, there is no policy space. For example, when you look at the issue of regulation, the right of states to regulate, that space is already out when it comes to the bilateral investment treaties. When you talk about CBDR, when you look at CBAM, all those regulations coming out of the European Union and elsewhere, the CBAM, the directives, it's not the polluter who is paying, it is the poor people who are paying. So how do we ensure that we address those contradictions?
Thank you, Jane. Appreciate. I think you were next.
Yeah, okay.
Is it okay if I take them all because we have to? Yeah, okay.
I think I want to engage in that subsidy versus cap and trade discussion a bit. I mean, isn't it, you said we should have understood externalities, but isn't there kind of 2 types, one environmental and the other technological, in a way that the pure carbon price just doesn't address, whereas a subsidy does exactly that, namely solve the coordination problem towards particular technologies, and isn't, I mean, in the end, what we had, whatever, German, other countries, US, European subsidies for renewable energies, now the Chinese, which are in the yellow bracket probably, isn't that exactly what has led us to the cheap energy, the affordable energy where we are now? I mean, so far that's all we've had, and isn't that for a good reason, is I guess my question here. Thank you.
Very good, and you stayed way below your time. Thank you for the contribution to the bank. You were second, I think?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Jakob Schwab from German Institute of Development and Sustainability.
I'm Gennaro Migliore and I'm from Center of Global Studies. There is often a feeling that we are in front of 2 separate worlds between economic powers and developing countries. And all you mentioned the necessity to invest, to create new jobs, and to lower the inequality. What do you think? It's a very small question, but I don't know if it is so easy to answer. If in the WTO it's possible to build a kind of global insurance like the exists in some countries to guarantee also some small and medium enterprises that they cannot take the risk of investment, foreign investment. For example, not only, I'm closing, not only for the low tech, but also for the medium tech.
Thank you.
It's Dr. Adam, Ben Gurion University, Israel, and I'm also a consultant in ESG. And I have a very specific question. Now, my question begins with how seriously do we take the principle of the pollution? The polluter has to pay for the pollution. And I would like really to speak about a very specific and concrete example like the global supply chain of plastic, and to take it, in fact, into the three mechanisms that you suggested. One, which is command and control, which is a very expensive one. Another one is the market mechanism. And the third one is subsidies. That is, how we are going to, if we really want to take it seriously, how we are going to translate this specific principle. And I think it's a very strong one. Because it goes in within our discussion in the last 30 years or so to internalize and so on. So this is my question. It's a very specific one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about
No worries. No, that's my job.
I'm going to use it when I'm chairing. No, I learned something today. I'm chairing the discussion. It's a learning session.
Yeah, I'll come back to her. Ibis first. Yeah.
Mustafa Bayoumi, I'm a climate change research fellow here at the Diplomatic Academy, and I was advising the UAE lead negotiator at COP28 on just transition. And so I'll actually keep my question, you have a lot to answer, so I'll keep it to the coffee break, try to reach out, but just maybe a comment that at COP28, one of the positive outcomes was a just transition work program. So there will be two dialogues, one at Bonn in June, one at COP29. So I really invite you, if you're interested in just transition, this would be a great opportunity to do a deep dive into certain topics of the country's choice. So I just want to leave you with that.
Thank you, and not just countries, because all stakeholders were allowed to submit some suggestions until 15
I was going to say parties,
February.
and then I said countries, and then it should be stakeholders.
And we did submit something with our colleagues on what I was mentioning at the beginning of the modeling of where synergies are, where the trade-offs are, because it's only then that you can start having a discussion on technology, on the financing, on these instruments.
What was the announcement?
You want to repeat it quickly?
Sure. So
20 seconds.
we agreed on a just transition work program at COP28, and part of it is two dialogues. So one will be in Bonn. Actually, both of them are supposed to be hybrid as well, but the part taking place in person is in Bonn in June, and then another one at COP29. And they normally take in submissions from stakeholders. So if you want to contribute.
Thank you. Ma'am, you be patient.
Thank you. My name is Olivia Costa. I'm from Tanzania Trade Investment Coalition. It's just to echo what he was saying about is trade disruptive. For me, it is disruptive because it is sustainability negative. For example, if you take for developing countries, which loses its power to regulate when they sign contracts, or when it comes to investment facilitation for development to attract investors, and the end result is the number of ISDS huge awards that normally countries get. For example, Tanzania, if you follow the issues of ISDS, we have a lot of cases, and we've gone through a lot of awards. So for me, trade is destructive because it's not for development positive, it's negative.
Thank you. And indeed, the investment state dispute resolution we didn't address, but they can have huge impact in terms of these policies. Will it be quick, sir?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
When I see, my name is Everest Munyampundu. I'm working with, I'm a customs officer by professional. I'm working with the South African Community Secretariat. When you look at this issue of, I agree with the principle polluter pays. After paying, so what? These are bad guys, polluters, I can say, as we are good guys, environmentalists. When you look at the enforcement side of environment, climate inspectors and at the borders, customs officers, we have clear rules. The renewable energy solutions are exempted, and the dangerous goods are prohibited. But when you look at, you make an assessment, you find one section in a port, one port, customs, they don't know that gas. They don't have tools. We have to pay and see how to invest in enforcement authority.
Yeah, enforcement, it's true. We didn't touch the base on the enforcement, which could be very expensive indeed. Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes or less. So, many questions. I'm not going to summarize them because it would
There was
make
one
these
back
over.
there still open, sorry. Okay.
Yara, are you sure? Can you do it in 20 seconds?
Yes, well, can I just briefly say something? I definitely agree with what Dan said regarding
Don't be
the
polite.
subsidies.
Question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are interesting developments at the preferential levels when it comes to these balancing tests and incorporating other externalities that subsidies may actually incorporate. So there is a very interesting example in the EU preferential trade agreements, and we're going to elaborate on that in a panel this afternoon.
Excellent.
But my question was, don't you think that the WTO, there probably is a lack of expertise in actually balancing the trade distortive effects of subsidies and sustainability positive effects of subsidies for the green transition? In the UPTAs, for instance, we do have
Thank
this
you. Thank you.
figure of trade and
Thank you.
sustainability.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
We got it. We got it. Thank you. Thank you, Yara. Sorry about that. But I think we got the point. So, who wants to start? Caroline, do we start with you to start?
Sure, I can go really fast.
2 minutes each, is that what we're at?
2.5 maybe. Yeah.
I'm just going to go back to forward looking. We're here at the WTO. So what are some of the discussions we need to be having if we want to take forward a sort of just transition perspective on this climate and trade discussion? So the first is, I think at the WTO, we need to create space urgently to have multilateral dialogue on climate, trade, and sustainable development. We need to find ways that governments can engage. The issues are here. We can't hide from them, so we need to engage on those. Hopefully this week they will create some paths forward on that. Governments are engaging in many different ways, but a specific thing we need to do in light of this conversation is find ways to link the discussions on environment to discussions at WTO on debt and finance, and also on technology and also on development. So that will require some procedural innovation about how dialogue happens there, because especially for developing countries, we won't have just transition if we don't link it to debt, finance, investment and technology. So the second thing is the breaking down silos between international processes, and here I thank our colleague who was involved in the COP28 process for reminding us that there are all of these processes that get set forth by the COP process, many of which are relevant to trade. And so our challenge is to keep track of those as well and contribute to those constructively, because the trade piece is the piece where we get all of the tension in the world. And so if we don't talk about that also in the climate context, we're going to face trouble. And then the third thing to say is that at the national level, I think that we just need to think much harder about the policy coherence nationally around trade, finance, climate, and development. A key thing being that for many countries to tackle the challenge that you've mentioned around poverty and inequality, it's also an issue of economic diversification and development. So we have to keep that in mind. My last plug is please contribute to the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate, which is trying to do a great effort of exactly that, of breaking down these silos, of getting governments to work more collaboratively and also with different parts of government as well.
Thank you so much.
205, not bad.
Pretty good. Standards been set. Dan, I said.
There you go. You want to take the last word and you can summarize. Thank you. So just on coming to your point, I think there are a few things which are the software and few things that are the hardware in discussions and negotiations. And I think we are probably not paying enough attention in this room to the software, which is trust is the foundation of any global development process. And we see that eroding, so we need to invest back into that. Unity of purpose is the second software which is needed. And we need to invest in that we are all looking to one purpose and in all these processes. And then probably the third one, which I was thinking about, is that the developed countries are announcing how they will contribute to this effort. So EU's Green Deal or US Inflation Reduction Act, these are their policy announcements on the way. I think developing countries need to develop their own agenda on the issue and then come out that, okay, this is our policy announcement. That's how we will be dealing with the challenges. Second point, sustainable transition will not happen in an unsustainable macroeconomic environment and financial architecture. So while we stay focused on the targeted, let's say, trade, development, poverty, extra issues, we need to stay focused on the rules of the game which have made whatever we have today possible and change them. And that's probably your point was. Global financial architecture needs to change. It's not going to change with the trade policy, but the green trade will not happen if the global financial architecture is not there. And we have seen, we did some initial efforts, inquiry into the global financial architecture, the UNEP work, which announced that there was nothing on sustainable development in Basel II, and nothing on poverty actually, even now. So that is the second point. So stay focused on the rules of the game as well. Number 3, and let me finish with that point, that this is a moment of celebration. We never had so much wealth that we have today. We never had so much finance in our banks that we have today. We never had so much production capacity, both on agriculture and industrial side that we have today. And we never had so many technological breakthroughs that we have today. It's possible we can make the change happen. And I'll close with someone said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only way things have happened so far.
Margaret Mead.
There you go, sir.
Very good way to end. Pick it up, Dan.
All right, so first of all, let me just react to Assad and say I think it is absolutely essential that we have trade reform and finance reform together. In fact, I would be very much in favor of a Bretton Woods architecture rethink, going beyond the Bridgetown agenda to really reflect all 3 of the Bretton Woods institutions in reform. And to Jane's point, I do think we need to reassert that the trade system itself is people-oriented. And I think the core of the problem that you raise is the capture of the system in the 1980s and 90s by what I would describe as neoliberal thinking. It's the Thatcher revolution in Britain, the Reagan revolution in America. It's a deregulatory agenda. It's market fundamentalism. And we need to regain control over the trade system with that broader people-oriented centerpiece. And just quickly to Pradeep, I do believe that innovation is fundamental. And we need a structure that promotes innovation. And as several people said, innovation relevant to the different country circumstances. So this is not all Silicon Valley high tech. A lot of it is much more low tech, but still critical. And I do think several people said, and I want to just echo this as correct, that subsidies are part of a package. So I think that we're not going to get away from just having market mechanisms, no matter that they might be the economist's first choice. We do need to have a mixed picture, and there are some market failures, particularly around scale of capital required to drive change, risk to drive change, that you can't get with market mechanisms alone. And I do think, and this is to those that were talking about the 2 worlds, that the role of government and of the international institutions in de-risking the change is critical. 2 last points. I think it is true that we have a lack of experience and expertise in our institutions for how to do the balancing, and that's where you had several people say we need the conversation. I totally agree with that. And now, just to push back on Jane, having said that she had us on the right track, I'm now going to say that I have a worry that developing countries are fearful of the change towards a sustainable future for fear that it's going to create market access obstacles. And I think that is wrong. I think fundamentally we've got developing countries that are going to be enormously advantaged in a sustainability bounded world where sustainability matters more, not less. And so I would encourage all of you to debate the system, but make sure that you go in with a positive spirit, that a lot of work is being done around what's called green competitiveness. And what is emerging is that in a world that's coming, where competitiveness is in part a function of access to low-cost clean energy and other elements of the competitive world, it's going to turn out that there is a shift. And the number 1 place that the shift is going toward is Africa. And the number 2 place is Latin America. And so this is not that it overcomes every other competitive advantage of assembled capital and human investment and all of this, but there is a big emerging opportunity. So go into it with an open spirit and make sure that it's done fairly.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you so much, everyone, for sticking to your time. I have a few words to say. No. I negotiated 1 extra minute for myself. So basically, I think we heard a lot of things, and I think what you just said, Assad and Dan, in response to Jane, and Jane and I had that conversation yesterday. The G7 have, and then I'm going to sound colonist by saying that, but hear me out. The G7 had a tendency, because things are moving so fast, to be reactive as opposed to be proactive. It is time for the G7 to sit down and come up with their own plan, as Assad said, and be proactive. And I think one of the good way to do that is through the next round of nationally determined contribution, where you can put what is it that your national plan is, and then sit with partner and co-create, first at the national level with the UNEP, the UNCTAD, and other partners, what policy and what you need, and then with the international partner, what is it where you don't add it nationally that you could get to the table, including affordable access to the adequate technology. The second point I'd like to emphasize is, again, co-creation, space for dialogue, and sometimes that space may not be WTO, because people have their negotiating hat on. So maybe sometimes it's the UN. So feel free to use the UNEP, the UNCTAD of the world, where you can have these discussions along with our partners. The final one is, as you know, the Secretary General of the UN has called for the Summit of the Future this September, where we will be discussing the reform of the international financial architecture. They've all alluded to it, but they didn't mention it. I want to make sure we mention it. And I'm kind of puzzled that we don't have trade reform there. And it says a lot, I think. And finally, the final word I promise, we did submit a green and just transition plan to the G20 that went to Brazil. And we hope that many of these issues are in there. But I think we're embarking on the largest transformation of our economies we ever done. We're going to have to be humble, learn and assess and learn as we go, and listen to each other. So, and not assume that I know better and I can do it alone, because none of us can do it alone. We only can do it together. So thank you so much.